If you had walked into the Oval Office on a gray, freezing afternoon in the winter of 1946, you would have found President Harry Truman staring intently at a large map of the North Atlantic pinned to the wall. The Second World War was finally over. The ticker tape from the victory parades in Times Square had been swept away by the street cleaners. The boys were coming home. But Harry Truman was not a man at peace. He was a man preparing for a new kind of war, a silent war. A war that would not be fought with tanks churning up the mud of France or Marines storming the beaches of the Pacific. It would be fought with long-range bombers in the stratosphere and nuclear submarines prowling the crushing depths of the Arctic Ocean. As he traced his finger across the map, his eyes kept returning to one massive white shape that dominated the top of the globe: Greenland. To the average American. In 1946, Greenland was nothing more than a jagged block of ice on the weather map. It was a place of Eskimos and polar bears in eternal winter, a blank space. But to Harry Truman and his military strategists in the newly formed Joint Chiefs of Staff, it was the single most important piece of real estate on the planet. They knew a terrifying secret of geography. If the Soviet Union ever decided to attack the United States, the bombers would not fly across the Atlantic or the Pacific. They would fly over the North Pole. It was the shortest route. It was the highway of the apocalypse. And Greenland sat directly in the middle of that highway. It was the shield of North America. But there was another reason Truman was obsessed with this frozen island. It was a reason hidden deep in the naval strategy of the Atlantic Alliance. It was a choke point known to admirals as the GIUK Gap. This acronym stood for Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. It referred to the narrow stretches of storm-tossed ocean between these three landmasses. It was the only exit door for the Soviet Navy. If Russian submarines wanted to break out of their frozen bases in Murmansk and get into the open Atlantic to threaten American shipping, they had to pass through these gaps. If the United States controlled Greenland, they could bolt that door shut. They could turn the North Atlantic into an American lake. So Harry Truman made a decision that would remain a classified secret for decades. He decided to buy Greenland. He did not want to lease it. He did not want to occupy it temporarily. He wanted to own it. He wanted the stars and stripes to fly over the glaciers forever. He authorized his Secretary of State, James Burns, to make an offer to the Danish government. And the offer was stunning: $100 million. In 1946, that was a fortune. It was equivalent to over $1.5 billion today. But Truman didn't just offer paper money. He knew that Europe was broken and currencies were unstable. He offered to pay in solid gold bars from the vaults of Fort Knox. This is the story of the greatest real estate deal that never happened. It is the story of a desperate post-war Europe, a rising American empire, and a secret negotiation that could have changed the map of the world. If Denmark had said yes, the United States would have been an Arctic superpower 50 years earlier. The Cold War would have looked completely different. And the 56,000 people who live in Greenland today would be American citizens carrying U.S. passports. To understand why Truman thought he could simply buy an entire country, we have to look at the precedent. This wasn't the first time the U.S. had gone shopping in Copenhagen. In 1917, as the First World War raged across Europe, the United States was terrified that Germany would seize Denmark's colonies in the Caribbean. They approached the Danes with a bag of cash. For $25 million in gold, Denmark sold the Danish West Indies to America. Overnight, the islands became the U.S. Virgin Islands. The Danish flag came down and the American flag went up. It was a clean transaction. Land for gold. Truman looked at that history and thought, why not do it again? Why not buy the northern colony just like we bought the southern one? But the situation in 1946 was more complex. The man who stood between Truman and his prize was a ghost from the war. His name was Henrik Kaufmann. Henrik Kaufmann is one of the most fascinating and forgotten figures of the 20th century. He was the Danish ambassador to Washington during World War II. When the Nazis invaded Denmark on April 9, 1940, the Danish government in Copenhagen surrendered almost immediately. They had no choice. The German war machine was too strong. But sitting in Washington, Kaufmann refused to surrender. He declared that the government in Copenhagen was acting under duress, and therefore he did not have to obey them. He declared himself the independent representative of a free Denmark. He was essentially a rogue ambassador. On the anniversary of the German invasion, Kaufmann did something extraordinary. He signed a treaty with President Franklin Roosevelt on his own authority. He gave the United States permission to build military bases on Greenland to protect it from the Nazis. He signed the document Henrik Kaufmann, representing the king. The government in Copenhagen was furious. They charged him with high treason. They fired him. They demanded he come home. Kaufmann ignored them. He was dubbed the King of Greenland. For 4 years, he ran the island from his office in Washington, D.C. He allowed the U.S. Army to build runways, weather stations, and radar posts. Because of Kaufmann, the United States had essentially been occupying Greenland for 5 years by the time the war ended. The American generals had grown comfortable there. They had poured millions of dollars into infrastructure. They had built the bluey West 1 airfield in the south. They had hunted German weather teams on the ice in a secret war known as the Weather War. They felt a sense of ownership. Truman assumed that this wartime arrangement would just become permanent. He assumed the Danes would be grateful to hand over the burden, but he miscalculated. When the war ended, Kaufmann was vindicated. He returned to Denmark a hero. The treason charges were dropped. He became a minister in the new government. But the experience had changed the Danish relationship with Greenland. The shame of the quick surrender to Germany haunted the Danish psyche. They had lost their sovereignty once. They were not about to sell it again. The man tasked with making the deal happen was James Burns. He was a smooth-talking politician from South Carolina, a man who knew how to twist arms. He met with the Danish foreign minister Gustav Rasmussen in New York in December of 1946. The setting was the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a symbol of American wealth and power. It was a meeting of conqueror and victim. Burns was confident. Rasmussen was nervous. Burns laid out the American case with the cold logic of a banker. He argued that Greenland was a crushing financial burden to Denmark. It was a massive frozen wasteland that cost millions of kroner to administer. It produced nothing but a few fish and some cryolite, a mineral used for aluminum. Why should a small, broken country like Denmark burden itself with the defense of a continent-sized island? The United States, he argued, was the natural owner. Geographically, Greenland is part of North America. Strategically, it is vital to the U.S. Then he dropped the number, $100 million. Rasmussen was stunned. He knew his country was broke. The Nazi occupation had looted the Danish treasury. The infrastructure was crumbling. People were burning peat for heat because there was no coal. $100 million in gold could rebuild Copenhagen. It could build modern hospitals, schools, and factories. It could jumpstart the Danish economy and save a generation from poverty. For a moment, the temptation must have been overwhelming. The logic of the spreadsheet said, sell. But nations are not businesses. They are made of history and identity. Rasmussen looked at Burns, and he saw the arrogance of a new empire. He saw a man who thought everything had a price, and he saw something else, fear. Rasmussen knew that the biggest reason for the hesitation was not just pride. It was fear of the Soviet Union. Denmark was a small, flat country sitting right on the doorstep of the Russian Bear. The Red Army was occupying eastern Germany just a few hundred miles from the Danish border. Soviet submarines were patrolling the Baltic Sea. If Denmark sold Greenland to the U.S., Stalin would see it as a hostile act. He would see it as Denmark officially joining the American camp. He might decide to invade Denmark to punish them or to secure the Baltic exit. Rasmussen was walking a tightrope over a pit of wolves. He had to say no to the Americans without making them angry, and he had to keep the island without angering the Russians. The negotiations dragged on in secret. The U.S. military kept pushing. They drafted plans for massive bases. They drew maps where Greenland was colored in the same blue as the United States. They even discussed what to name the new state. Would it be the state of Greenland, the territory of the North? While the diplomats argued in hotels, the reality on the ground in Greenland was changing. The Cold War was freezing over. The U.S. military wasn't waiting for a deed of sale. They were already digging in. In the far north of Greenland, at a place called Thule, a secret construction project began. It was codenamed Project Blue Jay. It was one of the largest engineering feats in history. The U.S. Navy shipped thousands of men and millions of tons of equipment into the Arctic night. They arrived in the summer when the ice broke, but they worked through the 24-hour darkness of winter. They built a massive airbase on the permafrost. They built a runway 10,000 feet long capable of handling the heavy B-36 Peacemaker bombers. These bombers were the stick that Truman carried. They were monsters of the sky with 6 propeller engines and 4 jet engines. They were designed to carry nuclear weapons deep into the Soviet Union. Thule was the perfect launch pad. From Thule, a bomber could reach Moscow and return without refueling. It was the dagger pointed at the heart of the Soviet Union. The construction of Thule was done in total secrecy. The Danish government was told very little. The local Inuit population was told nothing. In fact, a local tribe of Inuit people who had lived on the land where the base was built for centuries became the victims of a tragedy known as the Great Eviction. In May of 1953, simply to expand the anti-aircraft perimeter of the base, the U.S. commanders told the Danes that the locals had to go. The Danish officials, afraid to upset their American protectors, gave the order. The Inuit were given just a few days to pack their sleds. They were forced to leave their homes, their hunting grounds, and their ancestral graves. They walked north on the ice into the biting wind to a new settlement called Qaanaaq, nearly 100 miles away. They lived in tents on the ice while they built new sod houses. It was a forced march that shattered the community. For decades, the Danish government denied it had been a forced eviction, claiming the locals had moved voluntarily. It was a lie born of the desperate need to keep the Americans happy. So, while Truman was offering money in New York, his generals were simply taking the land in Greenland. It was a de facto occupation. The U.S. knew that Denmark could not stop them. What was the Danish army going to do? Invade Thule against the U.S. Air Force? It was impossible. But the formal sale never happened. Rasmussen eventually summoned the courage to say no. He told Burns that honor prevented Denmark from selling a part of its kingdom. He said that Greenland was not a colony to be traded, but a part of the Danish family. It was a polite diplomatic rejection. But it was firm. Truman was disappointed, but he was a pragmatist. He realized that buying the island might actually cause more trouble than it was worth. It would look like American imperialism. It would give the Soviets a propaganda victory. If he couldn't buy the island, he would do the next best thing. He would force Denmark to sign a defense treaty that gave the U.S. everything it wanted anyway, without the cost of ownership. In 1951, the Defense of Greenland Agreement was signed. It was a masterpiece of unequal negotiation. It gave the United States the right to build and maintain bases in Greenland. It gave them the right to fly over the territory. It gave them the right to station troops. It gave them legal jurisdiction over their own personnel. It was essentially a lease with no end date and no rent. Denmark kept the flag. The U.S. kept the power. This arrangement set the stage for one of the most dangerous periods in human history. The 1950s and 60s turned Greenland into the front line of the nuclear standoff. The ice sheet became militarized. The skies over Nuuk were filled with the white contrails of bombers carrying hydrogen bombs patrolling the edge of Soviet airspace. The strategic value of the GIUK Gap became the obsession of the U.S. Navy. They developed a strategy to block the gap. They laid vast networks of underwater microphones known as SOSUS arrays on the ocean floor between Greenland and Iceland. These microphones were so sensitive, they could hear a Soviet submarine starting its engines in Murmansk. Every time a Soviet sub tried to slip through the gap, the U.S. Navy knew. They would send P-3 Orion Hunter killer planes from bases in Iceland and Greenland to track them. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the dark, freezing waters of the North Atlantic. If the Soviets could get through the gap, they could park their missile submarines off the coast of New York. If the U.S. could hold the gap, the American homeland was safe. Greenland was the anchor of this defense line. Without Greenland, the gap was wide open. But the Americans were not satisfied with just bases on the surface. They wanted to go deeper. In 1959, the U.S. Army launched one of the most bizarre and ambitious projects of the Cold War. It was called Project Iceworm. Publicly, the Army told the Danish government they were building a research station called Camp Century. They said they were testing construction techniques in the ice. They built a city under the glacier. They dug massive trenches cut into the ice, covered them with steel arches, and buried them in snow. Inside these tunnels, they built barracks, dining halls, a movie theater, a chapel, and even a nuclear reactor to power it all. It was a marvel of engineering. But Camp Century was a lie. The real purpose of the base was to test the feasibility of Project Iceworm. The plan was to build a network of 2,500 miles of tunnels under the Greenland ice sheet. Inside these tunnels, they planned to deploy 600 nuclear missiles. These missiles would be mounted on trains constantly moving through the ice tunnels so the Soviets could never target them. It was the ultimate stealth weapon. A nuclear shotgun pointed at Russia from beneath the eternal ice. The Danish government knew nothing about the missiles. They had a strict policy of no nuclear weapons on Danish soil. The U.S. was planning to turn Greenland into the world's largest nuclear launch pad in direct violation of Danish sovereignty. Project Iceworm eventually failed, but not because of politics. It failed because of nature. The glacier moved faster than the engineers predicted. The tunnels began to warp and collapse under the immense pressure of the shifting ice. The nuclear reactor had to be removed. The base was abandoned in 1967, left to be crushed by the glacier. But the secret remained buried. This culture of deception came crashing down literally in 1968. On January 21st, a B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs caught fire over Baffin Bay. The crew ejected. The plane crashed onto the sea ice near Thule Air Base. The conventional explosives in the bombs detonated. They did not cause a nuclear explosion, but they shattered the radioactive cores of the weapons. Plutonium was scattered across the ice. It was a disaster of apocalyptic proportions. The U.S. and Denmark had to launch a massive cleanup operation codenamed Project Crested Ice. Hundreds of Danish and American workers were sent out onto the frozen sea in 20 below zero weather to scrape up the radioactive snow. They loaded it into tanks and shipped it back to the U.S. The accident revealed the truth. The U.S. had been using Greenland as a nuclear storage depot. The Danish public was outraged. The government in Copenhagen was humiliated. It was revealed that the Danish Prime Minister had given secret tacit approval for the flights despite the public ban. It was a scandal that shook the foundation of Danish democracy. But the strategic reality had not changed. The U.S. needed Greenland and Denmark needed the U.S. protection. The scandal was smoothed over. The alliance held. As we end the first part of this deep dive, we see a world shaped by this near miss. Truman didn't get the title deed, but he got the land. The check for $100 million was rejected, but the price was paid in sovereignty secrecy and the displacement of the Inuit people. But the story doesn't end in the Cold War. As the ice melts and the geopolitics shift, a new generation of American leaders is looking at the map again, and they are asking the same question Truman asked: why rent when you can buy? In the second part, we will look at how the legacy of the Truman offer led directly to the Trump offer of 2019. We will explore the modern strategic value of the island, not just for nukes, but for resources. And we will ask the question that no one dares to answer: what do the Greenlanders want? The rejection of Harry Truman's $100 million check in 1946 did not end the American fascination with Greenland. It merely drove it underground. For the next 70 years, the relationship between the United States, Denmark, and Greenland was defined by a strange paradox. Denmark owned the island on paper, but the United States owned the strategic reality. The island became a phantom zone of sovereignty where Danish laws applied to the people in the coastal villages, but American laws applied to the vast empty spaces of the ice. This uneasy truce held through the Cold War because the enemy was clear. The Soviet Union was the threat, and Greenland was the shield. But when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the calculation changed. The bombers stopped flying 24/7. The listening posts were scaled back. The SOSUS arrays were put on standby. For a brief moment, it seemed like Greenland might drift back into quiet obscurity, a place for climate scientists studying ice cores and tourists looking for the northern lights. But geography has a way of reasserting itself. As the 21st century dawned, two things happened that made Truman's old maps relevant again. First, the ice began to melt at a terrifying rate. Second, a new rival emerged in the east: China. The melting of the Arctic ice cap is the single biggest geopolitical change of our lifetime. It is opening up new shipping lanes that have been frozen since the last ice age. The northern sea route along the coast of Russia is becoming a highway for commerce, cutting the travel time between Asia and Europe by 40%. And Greenland sits at the intersection of these new lanes. It is the toll booth of the future Arctic economy. But more importantly, the melting ice revealed what was hidden underneath: rare earth minerals, uranium, gold, zinc, rubies. Greenland is not just a strategic choke point anymore, it is a treasure chest, and everyone wants a key. This brings us to August 2019. Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States, revived Harry Truman's ghost. He reportedly asked his aides, "Look into buying Greenland." The media laughed. Late-night comedians made jokes about gold towers in Nuuk. The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, called it absurd. It was treated as a joke, a moment of reality, TV diplomacy gone wrong. But if you look closely at the Trump offer, it was almost a carbon copy of the Truman offer. The logic was exactly the same. The U.S. saw a strategic asset that was vulnerable and underutilized. They saw a European power that they believed couldn't afford to maintain it. And they offered a transaction. The generals in the Pentagon were not laughing. They had briefed the president on the rare earth deposits at Kvanefjeld. They had briefed him on the Chinese attempts to build airports. They knew that buying the island was a clumsy but logical solution to a massive security problem. The difference was the reaction. In 1946, the rejection was polite and diplomatic, whispered in the hushed halls of the Waldorf Astoria. In 2019, it was public and sharp, shouted across Twitter. The world had changed. You can no longer buy countries like you buy golf courses. The people of Greenland, who were silent in 1946, now have a voice. They have a parliament. They have a sense of nationhood. But while the purchase failed, the strategic maneuver worked. The offer was a signal flare. It woke up the Washington establishment. It forced the State Department to realize that they had ignored the Arctic for too long. Suddenly, the U.S. opened a consulate in Nuuk for the first time in decades. They sent millions in aid. They started courting the Greenlandic politicians. The check was rejected again, but the engagement began. The story of the GIUK Gap has also returned with a vengeance. During the Cold War, the Gap was about stopping Soviet submarines from attacking NATO convoys. Today, the Gap is about something else. It is about the digital spine of the global economy, the Atlantic fiber optic cables. 90% of the world's internet traffic flows through undersea cables that run along the ocean floor. The cables that connect Europe and North America run right through the waters south of Greenland. Every email, every bank transfer, every military order flows through these glass threads. If a hostile power wanted to cripple the Western economy, they wouldn't need to bomb New York. They would just need to cut those cables. Russian submarines have been spotted operating near these cables with increasing frequency. They have specialized ships like the Yantar capable of deploying mini-subs to the ocean floor. The U.S. Navy is terrified that in a conflict, Russia could sever the digital nervous system of the world, plunging the West into information darkness. So the GIUK Gap is once again the most important water on Earth. And Greenland is once again the unsinkable aircraft carrier that watches over it. The U.S. Navy has reactivated the Second Fleet specifically to guard this area. They are flying P-8 Poseidon aircraft from bases in Iceland and Greenland, just like they flew P-3 Orions in the old days. The technology has changed, but the geography remains the same. But there is a new player in the gap, China. Beijing calls itself a near-Arctic state. They have no coastline in the Arctic, but they have massive ambitions. They want to build a polar Silk Road. They see Greenland as a potential logistics hub for their shipping to Europe. In 2018, a Chinese state-owned company proposed to build 3 massive international airports in Greenland. The price tag was small for China, around $500 million, but it was huge for Greenland. It would have transformed the island's economy and connected it to the world. But it would have given Beijing control over the island's air traffic. It would have given them a foothold in the GIUK Gap. The reaction in Washington was panic. The idea of Chinese jets operating from Greenland was a red line. The US put massive pressure on Denmark. They told Copenhagen, "You cannot let this happen." Denmark, which usually tries to stay out of Greenland's internal affairs, had to step in. They used their veto power over national security issues to block the Chinese deal. Then, to smooth things over, the Danish government offered to finance the airports themselves. It was a classic example of checkbook diplomacy. The US didn't pay for the airports directly, but they forced their ally to pay to keep the rival out. It was the Truman Doctrine updated for the 21st century. Containment. The people of Greenland are watching this game with weary eyes. They know they are the prize, but they are tired of being treated as a chessboard. In 1953, the Inuit were evicted from Thule to make way for the bombers. They were given 4 days to leave their ancestral hunting grounds. They walked north on the ice, carrying their children and their tents. It took decades for them to receive an apology or compensation. That memory is still fresh. Today, the Greenlanders want independence. They are self-governing, but they still rely on a block grant from Denmark to pay for their schools and hospitals. It covers about half of their public budget. They know that to be truly free, they need money. And the only way to get money is to sell their resources or their strategic location. This creates a dilemma. Do they sell rights to Chinese mining companies and risk angering the US? Do they accept US military expansion and risk becoming a target in a war? Or do they stay with Denmark and remain a semi-colony forever? In the 2021 elections in Greenland, this dilemma came to a head. The election was fought over a massive mining project at Kvanefjeld. The site contains the world's largest deposit of rare earth minerals essential for electric cars and fighter jets. But it also contains uranium. The pro-mining party wanted to dig. The anti-mining party wanted to protect the environment. The anti-mining party won, effectively blocking the mine for now. But the pressure is not going away. The US needs those minerals to break China's monopoly on the tech supply chain. The Pentagon is investing directly in other mining projects in Greenland that don't involve uranium. They are trying to build a supply chain that bypasses China entirely using Greenlandic rocks. The irony of the $100 million offer is that Greenland is worth infinitely more than that today. The rare earth deposits at Kvanefjeld alone are worth billions. The strategic value of the Thule radar, which tracks satellites and missiles, is priceless. If Truman had bought it in 1946, it would have been the greatest return on investment in history. It would have made the Louisiana Purchase look like a bad deal. It would have secured American dominance for a century. But because the sale never happened, we are left with a complex web of alliances. The Kingdom of Denmark is a strange construct. It is a small European nation holding onto a massive Arctic territory that is slowly drifting toward North America, both geologically and politically. The US military is digging in for the long haul. They are upgrading the radar at Thule. They are surveying the deep waters of the fjords for submarine hiding spots. They are preparing for a future where the Arctic Ocean is navigable year-round. The Air Force is conducting exercises to see if they can land F-35 fighters on frozen lakes. The Marines are training in cold weather warfare again. If you go to GIUK today, you will see the changes. You will see American diplomats hosting receptions. You will see construction cranes building new apartments funded by Danish pension funds, terrified of Chinese investment. You will see mining prospectors from Australia and Canada drinking beer in the hotels, talking about yields and drilling samples. The sleepy colonial outpost is waking up. The rejected check of 1946 is a ghost that haunts every meeting. It reminds everyone that sovereignty is fragile. It reminds the Danes that their hold on the island is based on history, not geography. It reminds the Americans that money cannot buy everything. And it reminds the Greenlanders that they are sitting on the most valuable rock in the world. The Cold War never really ended in Greenland. It just went into hibernation under the ice. And now, as the ice melts, the old conflicts are thawing out. The GIUK Gap is active. The bombers are watching. And the checkbook is still on the table waiting for a signature. The map on Harry Truman's wall in 1946 is the same map that hangs in the Situation Room today. The colors may have faded, but the reality is starker than ever. Whoever holds Greenland holds the world, and the United States has no intention of letting go even if they don't own the deed. The story of the $100 million offer is not a story of failure. It is a story of ambition. It showed the scale of American thinking. It showed a willingness to redraw the world to suit American security. And that ambition has not disappeared. It has just changed shape. Instead of gold bars, it is now defense treaties and consulate openings and rare earth investments and airport financing. The heist didn't happen in 1946. But in the slow motion way of empires, the takeover is happening every day. The United States is buying Greenland inch by inch, influence by influence, contract by contract. And one day we may look back and realize that the sale went through after all, just without the check. The flag flying over the ice may still be red and white, but the power that moves beneath it is red, white, and blue. This is John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.